Chapter A. Why Knowledge. Introduction. Knowledge, like being, is a term of comprehensive scope. Its comprehensiveness is, in a way, correlative with that of being. The only thing which cannot be an object of knowledge or opinion, which cannot be thought about in any way except negatively, is that which has no being of any sort. In short, nothing. Not all things may be knowable to us, but even the skeptic who severely limits or completely doubts man's power to know is usually willing to admit that things beyond man's knowledge are in themselves knowable. Everyone except Berkeley would agree that the surfaces of bodies which we cannot see are not, for that reason, in themselves invisible. The consideration of knowledge extends, therefore, to all things knowable, to all kinds of knowers, to all the modes of knowledge, and all the methods of knowing. So extensive an array of topics exceeds the possibility of treatment in a single chapter and requires this chapter to be related to many others. The cross-references which follow the references indicate the other chapters which deal with particulars we cannot consider here. For example, the nature of history, science, philosophy, and theology, and their distinction from one another, are treated in the chapters devoted to those subjects. So, too, the chapters on metaphysics, mathematics, physics, mechanics, and medicine deal with the characteristics and relations of these special sciences. The psychological factors in knowing, the faculties of sense and mind, of memory and imagination, the nature of experience and reasoning, also have their own chapters. Still other chapters deal with the logical elements of knowledge, such as idea and judgment, definition, hypothesis, principle, induction, and reasoning, logic and dialectic. The program which Locke sets himself in his essay Concerning Human Understanding is often taken to include the basic questions about knowledge. His purpose, he tells us, is to inquire into the original, certainty, and extent of human knowledge, together with the grounds and degrees of belief, opinion, and assent. Two other matters, not explicitly mentioned by Locke in his opening pages, assume central importance in the fourth book of his essay. One is the question about the nature of knowledge itself. The other concerns the kinds of knowledge. It may be thought that certain questions are prior to these and all others. Is knowledge possible? Can we know anything? The man the skeptic challenges is one who thinks that knowledge is attainable and who may even claim to possess knowledge of some sort. But the issue between the skeptic and his adversaries cannot be simply formulated. Its formulation depends in part upon the meaning given knowledge and the various things with which it is sometimes contrasted, such as belief and opinion, or ignorance and error. It also depends in part on the meaning of truth and probability. It would seem, therefore, that some consideration of the nature of knowledge should precede the examination of the claims concerning knowledge which provoke skeptical denials. The theory of knowledge is a field of many disputes. Most of the major varieties of doctrine or analysis are represented in the tradition of the great books, but the fact that knowledge involves a relationship between a knower and a known seems to go unquestioned. William James expresses this insight, perhaps more dogmatically than some would allow, in the statement that knowledge is a thoroughgoing dualism. It supposes two elements, mind knowing and thing known. Neither gets out of itself or into the other, neither in any way is the other. 880i. Chapter 43, Knowledge. 881. Neither one is the other. They just stand face to face in a common world, and one simply knows, or is known unto, its counterpart. This remains true even when attention is turned to the special case of knowledge about knowledge or the knower knowing himself. The mind's examination of itself simply makes the mind an object to be known as well as a knower. This suggests a second point about the nature of knowledge which seems to be undisputed. If knowledge relates a knower to a known, then what is somehow possessed when a person claims to have knowledge, is the object known. It does not seem possible for anyone to say that he knows something without meaning that he has that thing in mind. Some sort of signal, James writes, must be given by the thing to the mind's brain, or the knowing will not occur. We find as a matter of fact that the mere existence of a thing outside the brain is not a sufficient cause for our knowing it. It must strike the brain in some way, as well as be there. To be known, what is not in any way present to or represented in the mind is not known in any of the various senses of the word know. What the mind cannot reach to and somehow grasp cannot be known. The words which are common synonyms for knowing, apprehending and comprehending, convey this sense that knowledge somehow takes hold of and surrounds its object. That knowledge is a kind of possession. Occasions the comparisons which have been made between knowledge and love. The ancients observed that likeness and union are involved in both. Plato, for example, suggests in the Symposium that both the knower and the lover strive to become one with their object. Love is also a philosopher, Diotima tells Socrates, and, as a lover of wisdom, the philosopher is also a lover. With regard to some objects, love and knowledge are almost inseparable. To know them is to love them. But this does not hold for all objects, nor does the inseparability of knowledge and love in certain cases prevent their analytical distinction in all. Like is known by like, but unlikes attract each other. Furthermore, according to one theory of knowledge, expounded by Aquinas, the knower is satisfied to possess an image of the thing to be known. This image provides the likeness through which knowledge occurs, and thus, Aquinas writes, the idea of the thing understood is in the one who understands. The lover, on the other hand, is inclined to the thing itself. As existing in itself, he seeks to be united with it directly. The nobility or baseness of the object known does not affect the knower as the character of the object loved affects the lover. This understanding of the difference between knowledge and love leads Aquinas to say that to love God is better than to know God, but, on the contrary, to know corporeal things is better than to love them. The principle of likeness between knower and known does not go undisputed. On the contrary, the opposite views here form one of the basic issues about the nature of knowledge. The issue is whether the thing known is actually present to the knower, existing in the mind or consciousness exactly as it exists in itself, or whether the thing is represented in the mind by a uniqueness of itself, through which the mind knows it. In this view, the mode of existence of the thing outside the mind is different from the way in which its representative exists in the mind. Berkeley, at one extreme, identifies being and being known. As to what is said of the absolute existence of unthinking things without any relation to their being perceived, that seems perfectly unintelligible, he writes. Their esse is percipi, nor is it possible they should have any existence out of the minds or thinking things which perceive them. At the other extreme are those Kant for whom the thing in itself is unknowable precisely because there can be no resemblance between the phenomenal order of objects represented under the conditions of experience and the noumenal order of the unconditioned. All conceptions of things in themselves, he writes, must be referred to intuitions, and with us men these can never be other than sensible, and hence can never enable us to know objects as things in themselves but only as appearances. The unconditioned, he adds, can never be found in this chain of appearances, and between these extremes there are those who agree that things exist apart from being known without ceasing to be knowable, but who nevertheless differ with respect to whether. 882 The great ideas the thing exists in reality in the same way that it exists in the mind. The several forms of idealism and realism, distinguished in the chapter on idea, mark the range of traditional differences in the discussion of this difficult problem. For ant theory of what knowledge is, there is a distinction between knowledge and ignorance, between having or not having something in mind, nor does anyone confuse ignorance and error. The mind in error claims to know that of which, in fact, it is ignorant. This, as Socrates points out in the Meno, makes it easier to teach a person aware of his ignorance than a person in error, for the latter, supposing himself to know, resists the teacher. Hence getting a person to acknowledge ignorance is often the indispensable first step in teaching. But though the difference between knowledge and ignorance and that between ignorance and error seems to be commonly understood, it does not follow that everybody similarly agrees upon the difference between knowledge and error. This much is agreed, that to know is to possess the truth about something, whereas to err is to be deceived by falsity mistaken for truth. The disagreement of the philosophers begins, however, when the meaning of truth and falsity is examined. Truth is one thing for those who insist upon some similarity between the thing known and that by which it is known or represented in the mind. It is another for those who think that knowledge can be gained without the mediation of images or representations. In the first case, truth will consist in some kind of correspondence between what the mind thinks or understands and the reality it tries to know. In the other, truth will be equivalent to consistency among the mind's own ideas. The examination of this fundamental disagreement is reserved for the chapter on truth. Here the identification of knowing with having the truth calls for the consideration of another distinction, first made by Plato. In his language, as in that of Aristotle and others, it is the difference between knowledge and opinion. Sometimes, as with Locke, a similar distinction is made in terms of knowledge and judgment, sometimes it is made in terms of knowledge and belief, sometimes in terms of adequate and inadequate, or certain and probable, knowledge. The difference between these opposites, that between knowledge and error, is not a matter of truth and falsity. There is such a thing as right opinion, according to Socrates, and it is not less useful than knowledge, considering the truth so far as it affects action. Socrates claims that the man with right opinion will be just as good a guide if he thinks the truth, as he who knows the truth. The difference between right opinion and knowledge is here expressed by the contrast between the words thinks and knows. It does not consist in the truth of the conclusion, but in the way that conclusion has been reached or is held by the mind. The trouble with right opinion as compared with knowledge, Socrates explains, is that it lacks stability and permanence. Right opinions are useful while they abide with us, but they run away out of the human soul and do not remain long, and therefore they are not of much value until they are fastened by the tie of the cause, or, in other words, until they are fixed in the mind by the reasons on which they are grounded. When they are bound, Socrates declares, they have the nature of knowledge and they are obeding. At this point in his conversation with Meno, Socrates makes the unusual confession that there are not many things which I profess to know, but this is most certainly one of them, namely, that knowledge differs from true opinion. It may be that Socrates claims to know so little because he regards knowledge as involving so much more than simply having the truth, as the man of right opinion has it. In addition to having the truth, knowledge consists in seeing the reason why it is true. This criterion can be interpreted to mean that a proposition which is neither self-evident nor demonstrated expresses opinion rather than knowledge. Even when it happens to be true, the opinion is coiffed by some degree of doubt or some estimate of probability and counter-probability. In contrast, when the mind has adequate grounds for its judgment, when it knows that it knows and why, it has the certainty of knowledge. Capital I. Chapter 43, Knowledge 883. For some writers, such as Plato, certitude is as inseparable from knowledge as truth is. To speak of a false knowledge as well as a true seems to him impossible, and uncertain knowledge is a self-contradictory a phrase as false knowledge. Others use the word knowledge more loosely to cover both adequate and inadequate knowledge, the probable as well as the certain. They make a distinction within the sphere of knowledge that is equivalent to the distinction between knowledge and opinion. Spinoza, for example, distinguishes three kinds of knowledge. He groups the perception of individual things through the bodily senses, which he calls knowledge from vague experience, with knowledge from signs which depends on ideas formed by the memory and imagination. These two ways of looking at things, he writes, I shall hereafter call knowledge of the first kind, opinion or imagination. In contrast, that which is derived from our possessing common notions and adequate ideas of the properties of things, he calls reason and knowledge of the second kind. The third kind, which he calls intuitive science, is that sort of knowing which advances from an adequate idea of certain attributes of God to the adequate knowledge of the essence of things. Knowledge of the second and third kinds, he maintains, is necessarily true. That there can be falsity in the first kind, and only there, indicates that it is not genuinely knowledge at all, but what other writers would insist upon calling opinion. The several meanings of the word belief are determined by these distinctions. Sometimes belief is associated with opinion, sometimes with knowledge, and sometimes it is regarded as an intermediate state of mind. But in any of these meanings belief stands in contrast to make-believe, and this contrast has a bearing on knowledge and opinion as well. To know or to opine puts the mind in some relation to the real or actual rather than the merely possible, and subjects it to the criteria of truth and falsity. The mythical or imaginary belongs to the realm of the possible, or even the impossible, and the mind in imagining is fancy-free, free from the restraints and restrictions of truth and reality. Skepticism in its most extreme form takes the position that there is nothing true or false. But even those who, like Montaigne, deny certitude with respect to everything except matters of religious faith, do not go this far. In his apology for Raymond de Sebond he concedes that if opinions are weighed as more or less probable, their truth or falsity is implied, at least as being the limit which an increasing probability or improbability approaches. Referring to ancient skeptics of the academic school, he comments on the fact that they acknowledged some things to be more likely than others, as, for example, that snow is white rather than black. The more extreme skeptics, the Pyrrhonians, he points out, were bolder and also more consistent. They refused to aim toward one proposition more than toward another, for to do so, Montaigne declares, is to recognize some more apparent truth in this than in that. How can men suffer themselves, he asks, to incline to and be swayed by probability, if they know not the truth itself? How should they know the similitude of that whereof they do not know the essence? In this respect Montaigne's own skepticism tends to be of the more moderate variety, since, in the realm of action at least, he would admit the need for judgments of probability. But in all other respects, he takes a firm skeptical stand that nothing is self-evident, nothing has been proved, the contradictory of everything has been asserted or argued by someone. Men can have no principles, he writes, if not revealed to them by the divinity. Of all the rest, the beginning, the middle, and the end are nothing but dream and vapor. Every human presupposition and every declaration has as much authority, one as another. The persuasion of certainty is a certain testimony of folly and extreme uncertainty. The skeptical extreme is represented in the great books only through references to it for the purpose of refutation. Aristotle in the Metaphysics, for example, reports the position of those who say that all propositions are true or that all propositions are false, and who therefore deny the principle of contradiction and with it the distinction between true and false. But if all propositions are true, then the proposition some propositions are false is also true. If 884 The great ideas all propositions are false, the proposition all propositions are false is also false. The skeptic may reply, of course, that he is not checked by arguments which try to make him contradict himself, for he does not mind contradicting himself. To this there is only one answer, which is not to argue with the skeptic any further. From the skeptic's point of view, his position is irrefutable so long as he does not allow himself to accept any of the standards by which refutation can be effected. From his opponent's point of view, complete skepticism is self-refuting, because if the skeptic says anything definite at all, he appears to have some knowledge, or at least to hold one opinion in preference to another. His only choice is to remain silent. If he insists upon making statements in defiance of self-contradiction, his opponent can do nothing but walk away. It may seem a very extravagant attempt of the skeptics to destroy reason by argument and ratiocination, Hume writes, yet this is the grand scope of all their inquiries and disputes. He has in mind the excessive skepticism, or Pyrrhonism, from which he tries to distinguish a mitigated and beneficial form of skepticism. Referring to Berkeley's arguments against the independent reality of matter or bodies, Hume says their effect is skeptical, despite Berkeley's professed intention to the contrary. That his arguments are skeptical appears from this, that they admit of no answer and produce no conviction. Their only effect is to cause that momentary amazement and irresolution and confusion, which is the result of skepticism here and elsewhere, as in his comment on Descartes' skeptical method of doubting everything which can be doubted. Hume does not seem to think that excessive skepticism is refutable or even false, but it is impractical. The great subverter of Pyrrhonism, or the excessive principles of skepticism, he says, is action and employment, and the occupations of life. Extreme skepticism becomes untenable in thought the moment thought must face the choices of life and take some responsibility for action. There is, however, a more mitigated skepticism or academical philosophy which may be both durable and useful. This, according to Hume, consists in becoming sensible of the strange infirmities of human understanding,